One of the best things about pivot tables is they're just total flexibility in finding new ways to slice and dice and look at data. So when I have this pivot table built, I can actually just click that column heading and get rid of 2 of the cities really quickly, and I can get them back really quickly. I can change the way it looks by simply dragging location over to items. I can switch items in location. I can bring items over there. I can switch back. So that's one of the real benefits of pivot tables. Now they do have a slight weakness though. Everything in Excel and the formulas automatically updates. But if the data changes in a pivot table, it doesn't, and you have to go and refresh it. Okay? So let's scroll down a little bit and look at this pivot table. It's a smaller one than this one up here. This one up here was built off the main data set. But this one here is built off a smaller data set. Let's go look at it. This is on the Bakery Partial tab. And so that pivot table is constructed of this data right here. Okay, we just have Brooklyn, Manhattan, and the items and the sales and whatnot. So let me show you what happens. I've got Brooklyn and Manhattan there. What happens if I go to Bakery Partial and I decided that I got the stores wrong? Manhattan isn't Manhattan, it's really Queens. So if I do this and enter the data in there, then I go back to my pivot table, it still says Brooklyn and Manhattan. If I go back to my partial data and I deleted something, if I deleted some items, if I delete out all of these, the pivot table still shows all that data. It hasn't been refreshed yet. So let me go back to it first. I don't want to lose this, and I'll undo it. But let me just, I'll keep this change here. I'll keep this as Queens. So anytime that you make a change in a pivot table's data, you have to remember to refresh the data. And if you go to the pivot table analyze ribbon, there's a refresh button here. Now, if I'm on this pivot table and I click the refresh, it will refresh that pivot table. And now it updated Queens, put all the values in there. If I click the drop down and go to refresh all, it will refresh every pivot table in the workbook. Okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. I'm going to go back and change that back to Manhattan. And then I want this data to be all included together, all this data down here. So why don't I just move this together and delete these 4 rows, and then it'll be together. And I can do my update data. I can do my refresh, and it updated Manhattan, but nothing else. Look at the data source here where it says change data source. It'll take us right to it. It's still just on the original partial data. So I have to go in here and I have to resize this to be that whole table. So I can click here and I can resize that all the way down. And that will bring the entire table in. So with a lot of pivot tables, if you add data, you have to change the data source and include the extra rows. There's 2 tricks though where you don't have to do that. Okay, so let's go here and we'll go to change data source again. So if I am over here, I'm looking at the data source, I've selected the entire range, A1 to F127. I can actually just select the column headings and go A through F. And then I don't have to add new rows if I add new rows to this table. There is one little side effect to that, and that you're going to get a blank row because you're going to have a bunch of blanks now. You have blank columns and blank rows. So you can just take those check marks off. And the other solution, if I get rid of that, is to simply make that data a table. If you go up and format this as a table, and it's guessing that that's my data here, my table has headers, yep. And then you give that table a name. Then that's another way that you can make your pivot table attached to as a table. Go to change data source. And then you won't have to refresh then either if you add rows to that table. So that's just something to keep in mind though. As you make pivot tables, if you add or change the data in them, a lot of times you're going to have to go in and refresh that pivot table and bring all that data back to the new pivot table to see it again. All right, well, that's about it. Let's get ready for the next lesson.